So good evening, everyone. My name is Nupur Savani. I am the Vice President of Academics for Sigma Iota Rho. We are the official gender-inclusive honor society of the Elliott School of International Affairs at GW. And I'd like to thank you all for attending our first event for the fall semester. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, the Elliott Institute for African Studies, the Gender Equality Initiative in IA, and our student org co-sponsor, which is a new organization, the Young Black Professionals in IA. I'd like to welcome Hannah Jackson, the founder and president of YBPIA, to say a few words.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Nupur, for your kind introduction. I am thankful and honored to be here on behalf of Young Black Professionals in International Affairs. As a co-sponsor for this event, and more specifically, I look forward to hearing from our panelists this evening on the pervasive coloniality within the field of international relations, an issue that speaks to the very purpose of Young Black Professionals in International Affairs. If you are interested in learning more about YBPIA, I extend an invitation to join us at our first general body meeting next Wednesday, September 30th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Just to reiterate Nupur's remarks and introduce myself once again, my name is Hannah Jackson, and I am the founder and president of Young Black Professionals in International Affairs, otherwise known as YBPIA. Young Black Professionals in International Affairs is a student organization committed to enhancing African and African diaspora perspectives, conversation, participation, and scholarship in both the GW Elliott School of International Affairs and the field of international relations overall, through mentorship, professional and academic development, and community. Outside of providing a supportive and affirming environment for fostering intellectual community and facilitating the development of African and African diaspora studies and thought, our goal is to challenge prevailing Orientalist narratives that perpetuate the othering of non-white bodies, cultures, societies, and states in terms of academia, and also the lexicon in the field of international relations. The conventional narrative of the continent of Africa portrays a region as one that is beset with conflict, state fragility, and underdevelopment, without always acknowledging the historic role, the remnant, and how colonialism has been reinvented over the course of history through globalization, capitalism, and neoliberalism, all of which persist across the continent and create a pendulum of interdependence and contingency between African nations and the international community, politically, socially, and economically. Thus, I believe decolonizing the narrative of Africa starts with us first centering African perspectives in stories that have been silenced, removed, erased, and then replaced. And so my hope is that attendees leave this event tonight thinking critically about who has been and is being excluded, how we can dismantle dominant paradigms that center Eurocentrist ideologies, and in this case, emancipate the stories and histories that have been excluded from that discourse. From there, academics, diplomats, and institutions may be able to shift their view of the region, which requires not only unlearning, but also being honest about the role that they be playing in the current systems. And so again, I am honored to represent Young Black Professionals in International Affairs this evening, and I am excited to hear from tonight's phenomenal panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I think you did a great job of introducing why we're having this conversation. I'm the event coordinator of this event, and I'm also the moderator. I'm personally invested in having this conversation because I'm an international student from Kenya, and this is something that's important to me because I know that my privilege comes from these narratives, these flawed narratives that seek to keep African people, Africa as a continent underdeveloped. And I'm really excited to have this conversation. So thank you so much for your support, Hannah. I'm just going to introduce the topic a little bit more. The fields of international studies are rooted in Western epistemology, like Hannah said, and it has an implicit bias that mainstream frameworks of academia have failed to acknowledge. The distribution of power in the international relations scholarship has continued to erase important events from our understanding of global affairs. Academia has failed to examine African states and political actors as independent historical subjects and not simply objects in a Western dominated global structure. Africa is still seen as a poor, unchanging, and uncivilized peoples and continent. This conversation is different because we're not just going to be discussing African cultures, politics, and media. We're going to be discussing the flawed narratives that inform our understanding of the continent. So thank you so much to our speakers, Dr. Mzia Kimbona Clark, Dr. Namada Blyden, and Dr. Imani Cheers. Dr. Mzia Kibona Clark is an associate professor of African Cultural and Feminist Studies in the Department of African Studies at Howard University. In the spring semesters, she teaches hip hop and social change in Africa, a joint course between the Institute of African Studies at GW and Howard University. Her work focuses on representations of Pan-Africanism, African feminism, and African diaspora identities in popular culture. Her work examines hip hop and Africa's importance as social commentary, especially around Pan-Africanism and African feminist thought. Her work also explores how Black mobilization is shifting African and diasporan identities, and including the texts Hip Hop in Africa, Prophets of the City and Dusty Foot Philosophers, Pan-African Spaces, Essays on Black Transnationalism, and the forthcoming African Women in Digital Spaces, Redefining Social Movements on the Continent and in the Diaspora. Dr. Namada Blyden is a professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University. She holds a BA in History and International Relations from Mount Holyoke College and a master's in philosophy and PhD from Yale University. Dr. Blyden specializes in African and African diaspora history. In August, Dr. Blyden co-authored a book titled Between Africa and America, Recalibrating Black Americans, Relationship between African Americans and the African continent from the era of slavery to the present, examining the diversity of African American identities through relationships with the region, ethnicity, immigration, and slavery to investigate a fundamental area of African American studies. She's the author of West Indians in Africa, A Diaspora in Reverse. Professor Blyden was a consultant for In Emotion, the African American migration experience for the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Professor Blyden has lived in Africa, Europe, and the Soviet Union. She's also a member of Sigma Iota Rho and became one at Mount Holyoke as a student. Our final speaker, Dr. Imani Cheers, who is back with us. Dr. Imani Cheers is an associate professor of digital storytelling and the associate director in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. She's also the director of Academic Adventures for Planet Forward. Dr. Cheers received her first Bachelor of Fine Arts from Washington University in St. Louis and a Master's of Arts in African Studies and a PhD in Mass Communication and Media Studies from Howard University. Dr. Cheers is an award-winning digital storyteller, director, producer, and filmmaker. As a professor of practice, she uses a variety of mediums, including video, photography, television, and film to document and discuss issues impacting and involving people of the African diaspora. Her scholarly focus is on the intersection of women/girls, technology, health, conflict, agriculture, and the effects of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa. She's the author of The Evolution of Black Women in Television, and her work has been supported by the Ford Foundation and the International Reporting Project. She's also a regular contributor for international outlets including BBC, CGTN America, and CTN Canada, offering insight into American race relations and popular culture. In 2019, she was awarded GW's Graduate Mentoring Award, and in 2019, the Stobe Excellence in Teaching Award. So we're gonna go into a few prepared remarks, and we're gonna start with Dr. Mzia Kibona Clark.
Well, I want to first thank you. When you first sent me the invitation, I was really, honored. And even, when you sent the questions that we would be discussing, I was actually a little bit surprised. To be honest, I was like, wow, they're gonna, go there. Okay. I'm happy I have tenure. That's great because I'm not sure how honest I could be if I didn't. So I think that, and I'm so happy to share the panel with two women whose work I respect and who, I'm definitely a fan of. And I think that, just kind of being in academia, I think right now has been great because there are so many, I think, academics that are doing great work, that are doing purposeful work, that are doing intentional work to deconstruct a lot of the kind of African studies as a discipline was, as you mentioned in some of these questions, kind of built on colonialism, racism, capitalism. And so I think that what's been happening is this deconstruction, but I think it's kind of sped up quite a bit. And I'm seeing, especially with social media, a lot of young scholars are being a lot more vocal in their opposition to things. And so it's been really fun to see. I've seen things like young folks, well, to say young folks, scholars, younger scholars who are non-tenured, like, pre-tenure scholars, when I don't remember which university it was, put out their speakers list for the semester. And this is an African studies program. None of the speakers were African. They were all white scholars. And so there, one of the African scholars on Twitter, like literally called them out on it and hashtagged it, and it went viral on Twitter, causing that department to then have to say, and kind of reel it back in and, acknowledge and kind of deal with that issue. So I think right now it's been really, really great. So I'm really happy to see those things happening and to be able to be intentional but be also unapologetic in that intentionality. So yeah, I'm definitely, thank you for inviting me, and yeah, this is a great conversation.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kibona Clark. Dr. Blyden?
So I prepared a little bit more formal remarks because I wanted to approach it from the perspective of history and being a historian. And so what I've done in my remarks, and I hope I'm not sort of jumping the gun by addressing some of the questions that you're going to ask us, but I hope that in picking up on some of the things that you ask in your questions, that we then will have time to talk about them in the question and answer. So I want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to preface my remarks by saying that I have not approached this as a practitioner of international relations. I am a professor within the School of International Affairs. I majored in international affairs as an undergraduate, but primarily I see myself as a historian. And so I read your questions and I thought about this theme that we're going to be discussing today as a historian with a knowledge of the history of colonialism and decolonization at the core, right? So I'm not well versed in this theory of coloniality. I don't do theory, coloniality and decoloniality, though I recognize the subtle differences those terms denote. And I'm giving my age away. And Sia, you thought you were old? I'm really old, right? Because this is all fairly new to me. So I'm going to focus on a historical context. And, I'm sure when you all invited me, when the students invited me to speak on this subject, they didn't realize that I'm actually the great granddaughter of one of the earliest proponents of someone who promoted African indigenous knowledge systems and who made calls for decolonizing the African mind in the 19th century. So I'll take that privilege then of sharing some of his work as it relates to what we're talking about here today, which is decolonizing the narrative of Africa. So in 1881, in a talk entitled The Aims and Methods of a Liberal Education, Edward Wilmot Blyden called for a college in West Africa, quote, for the education of African youth by African instructors. He declared, the African must advance by methods of his own. He must possess a power distinct from that of the European. It has been proven that he knows how to take advantage of European culture and that he can be benefited by it. This proof was perhaps necessary, but it is not sufficient. We must show that we are able to go alone, to carve out our own way. We must not suppose that the Anglo-Saxon methods are final, that there is nothing for us to find out for our own guidance, and that we have nothing to teach the world. We look too much to foreigners, he said, and are dazzled almost to blindness by their exploits, so as to fancy that they have exhausted the possibilities of humanity. So he proffered this vision of an independent African college across the continent that would produce a new generation of African youth. He promoted the teaching of African languages, songs, oral traditions as part of higher education. And this was in the 19th century. Let me just say that again. He argued that education should not simply be for information, but for what he called the formation of the mind. The formation of the mind, he said, being secured, the information will take care of itself. Mere information of itself is not power, but the ability to know how to use that information. This ability belongs to the mind that is disciplined, trained, and formed. So essentially, he was talking about critical thinking, right? Which we all tend to encourage our students to do. So he may not have used the term decoloniality or coloniality, but that's exactly what he was talking about. At least that's how I read those statements. Right? So since the 19th century, when he wrote those lines, a long line of African scholars and intellectuals have called for similar institutions on the continent of Africa and curricula, not only on the African continent, but in American universities. I think we're talking about American universities today, right? And yet here we are in 2020, having a conversation on decolonizing the narrative of Africa. And I wondered when I got the invitation, and I still wonder why, how is it that in 2020, we have to have a panel, right, on decolonizing, right, the narrative of Africa, when we have a historical tradition of people of African descent who have spoken on the subject. And so I thought I would try and address some of these questions asked of me regarding legitimizing forms of knowledge, social practices that have been displaced or denigrated, as you all put it, by the history of colonialism, racism, and capitalism. But I'm not an expert in the field necessarily, and I don't have any grand public policy prescriptions to do, so I'm just ruminating, I should say, throwing out my thoughts as a person who's taught African history for almost 30 years, right? Who's taught about decolonization, who's taught about colonialism, who's taught about a whole host of things having to do with European influences on the continent of Africa and some of the damages that it has done, right? Whether we're talking about structural damages or whether we're talking about damages to people's minds, right? We're talking about decolonizing the mind. You also asked us to talk a little bit about this notion of disconscious racism, right? Which I thought was quite interesting because, it's highfalutin. It's not something that I've really dealt with or thought about. and it's something that I understand, given the way that you've defined it, as a means of racism that sort of accepts the dominant norms and privileges, right? By accepting the order of things. And that's, I think, is at the heart of what, scholars have talked about as a colonized mind, right? That we in colonized spaces bought into, right? This notion that European education was superior, that what Europeans brought to us was of a benefit to us. Fanon, right? Albert Memmi, Ngugi wa Thiong'o have all spoken with much authority on the subject, much more authority than I can ever speak to, right? And part of the problem, I think, of this persistence of coloniality, why we're talking about decolonizing the narrative of Africa in 2020, is the fact that although African spaces are no longer colonized physically, right, by Western powers, vestiges of those ideologies, whether it's in the education system and the epistemologies, remain, right? That's why we're having to have this conversation. So what Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan novelist, calls an inability to decolonize the mind, as he led this charge, and some of you hopefully know about that, for African literature to be written, right, in the native languages, in indigenous languages. Ngugi wa Thiong'o stopped decades ago writing in English, and he has his work translated. So for Ngugi, he says that language carries and culture carries, particularly through orature and literature, the entire body of values by which we come to perceive ourselves and our place in the world. So if we're to accept coloniality as this pattern, right, of power that's the result of colonialism, we can see that it has outlived colonialism, right? And that's the vestiges that we're fighting against, both on the continent, but also here, right? A large number of African scholars work outside of African universities, right? They're teaching in American universities. Meanwhile, scholars on the continent struggle, right? To get travel grants to come to American colleges, to get their works published, right? To get their articles in journals. And here again, I'll come back to Blyden because he has something to say about this. He says that the most important part of knowledge consists in knowing what other men, foreigners, have said about things, and even about Africa and about ourselves. They aspire to be familiar, not with what really is, but with what is presented. Hence, some of us are found repeating things against ourselves that are thoroughly injurious and false to us, only because we read them in books. He's talking about Africans, of course, or have heard them from foreign teachers, right? A result of this, he went on to say, is that we have not acted for ourselves. We have had a history written for us. And we know that I'm a historian, and I'm not going to sit here and say that African historiography has not progressed, right? A large bulk of what I assign my students in my African history classes is work that's been written by African scholars, right? Whether they're in the American Academy or not, or on the continent, we have a body of work now, right? That's coming from African scholars, right? So we have to sort of think about the ways in which we promote the idea, right, that Africans have valid and legitimate knowledge to share with the rest of the world. Knowledge can be gained, it can be accessed in a variety of ways, but what matters is how it's used, right? This critical thinking notion, right? African studies, at least in my field of history, has come a long way, as I just said. And as we have conversations about whether we call it decoloniality, decolonizing the mind, decolonizing the curricula, I would ask that we think about what we teach and how we teach about Africa, right? We must, as much as possible, incorporate and foster positive interactions between African systems of knowledge and that of the rest of the world, right? One that's based on mutual respect and understanding, right? But perhaps those of us who teach African studies should think about mostly, if not always, privileging Africa in our teaching. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blyden. Dr. Cheers?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I want to say in particular to my colleagues on the panel. It's truly an honor and a humble um, opportunity to be here with MCA. A little throwback, MCA and I were actually in graduate school together. I know MCA from long, long times. I will not. We have receipts. We have a lot to be there, so I'm grateful. It's always a pleasure to be connected. Yes, my roots are at Howard University, and I'm so grateful. And Dr. Blyden is a dear friend of mine, and I'm so grateful anytime I get to share her space, anytime. So thank you both. And thank you for those who invited me here. I'm just going to take a couple minutes and kind of give you all a intermediate version of my two colleagues and talk a little bit about 1960, the year of Africa, of course, to where we are now in 2020, and to think that 60 years. Um, 60 years, 60 years. It's a long time, yet depending on who you ask and where you're connecting, um, the progress has been bountiful and it's been slow. Am I allowed to show? Can I share some slides? I put together slides because I'm a nerd like that and I like a visual. Can
No,
I
we
share?
at Spider love that. You can share your content. There's a panel at the bottom alongside where it says mute and stop video. You should be able to share content.
I thought so. If it's being weird, I apologize. Outside of everything that you read in that ridiculously long bio, which, dear Lord, I need to like shorten. The other thing is that I'm the faculty in residence in on the Mount Vernon campus. So I live on campus. I'm in West Hall. And for anyone who has been on campus, I know for many people it might have been a while, but the internet is not as plentiful. So I was having some challenges earlier, and for the sake of time, because it looks like it's being a little wonky, so that's fine. But I'll just go ahead and read my slides, although I do love a good visual. So just imagine with me, participants who are listening and engaged, because if anyone knows me, they know I love a good image. But when I think of 1960, which the majority of you all on this call right now were not born. You weren't born, maybe your parents, maybe wherever, but I always like to know, and I like to ask my students, and I like to ask everyone. I am one of those people who I don't teach African history. I wish I did. Dr. Blyden, Dr. Mcia Cabona Clark, like someone hire me or give me a joint appointment because I would love to. That's what my background is in. I actually teach digital storytelling. I teach content creation. And it's glorious, but my passion and what I grew up and learned from, and um, I had the distinct pleasure and honor of, my family's from the United States immediately, but I grew up in Johannesburg. I went to the American International School of Johannesburg, so I graduated high school from. I go back to South Africa in particular often, annually, minus the pandemic. So when I look at this awesome map that none of you all can see, that looks at 1960 as a continent reborn, as I like to call it. And I like to ask my students when I have these conversations of like, what did you know about imperialism and colonization, in particular in Africa, and how the decolonization, the liberation movements on the continent and the events that led to 1960 and the fact that the independence of 17 different nations, 17 nations, South Africa not being one of them because apartheid was such a stronghold that it held on for another 34 years, actually, until 1994. But when you think of Nigeria, Mali, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast, Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Zaire, or depending on what you refer to it. But so many countries, 17 nations, gained their independence. And there's an image that I wish, and you know what? If I have a link that maybe I could put in the chat. If I do that,
Dr. Cheers, you should be able to share now.
Am I able to share now?
Yes.
You
should be able to have that.
Yeah, it's blanked out for us sharing.
Okay, because that would be awesome. In the meantime, I'm going to throw this clip in the chat as I sort of try to figure out how to share. And if I can, that'd be awesome. But if not, I do want to sort of send this, and maybe you all can see it, which, yeah, it's going to work or it's not. Hello, welcome to Technology 2020. It's that year. Before I even also continue, because I was going to say this and then I got sort of impassioned, but I want to take a moment to honor Breonna Taylor, and I want to take a moment to honor all of the victims and the unfortunate. They're not martyrs. They were never supposed to be martyrs. But whether it be a Breonna Taylor, whether it be a Stephen Biko, whether it be a Patrice Lumumba, if we really want to go back to 1960, the individuals that had been murdered by the state, whatever their state was, with impunity, and the souls that had been lost as a result of, generally speaking, white supremacy. We could break it down into other levels, but very generally speaking, white supremacy. And Breonna Taylor's death has been heavy on my soul, and I'm sure for many of the people on this call as well, because I feel like a lot of us are just like-minded individuals. But today's grand jury announcement, and the fact that her family will not see justice immediately, is very disheartening. It's very disheartening. It's not surprising. I think my panelists and my colleagues can understand where I come from when I say it's not surprising. But it's disheartening, and it's also exhausting. It's exhausting. It's exhausting. We all knew when the police declared a state of emergency in Kentucky, and specifically in Louisville yesterday, that we knew that some nonsense, quite frankly, excuse my language, sorry kids, some bullshit was getting ready to come down. We knew that that was going to happen. And then when it comes down and we're all left with, so what do we do? And it's the frustration, and we're having this larger conversation around decolonization, around Africa, around independence, around empowerment. I think back to the individuals that fought so hard for liberation and for freedom, and those who were murdered in the street, who were murdered by a variety of entities, and what that means for where we are right now in 2020. So apologies if you can hear my puppy barking, but she's also pissed. Her name is Winnie Mandela Cheers, and she's mad too. She's mad that we live in a world where you can be murdered while you're sleeping in your own house. Period. Going back to my remarks and my comments, and looking at sort of 60 years, and looking at 1960 and the Year of Africa, I look at it and called it a continent reborn. I would ask you, what did you know? What do you know? What are the images? I'm a multimedia person, so my question is always, what are the images that are the first thing that are on your mind when you think of the African continent, when you think of the African diaspora? It's not just the continent, but when you think of the diaspora, what are the first things that come to your mind? And I have this beautiful image from the New York Times interactive piece that they did about Rosemary Aziz, and she paraded through Lagos, and she was crowned Miss Independence on September 28th, so almost exactly 6 years ago, 1960, in Nigeria, as Miss Independence, and this absolutely glowing, stunning woman. But what are the images that you think of when you think of the continent? I also looked at in my remarks 60 years of education. 60 years of education, when I think of how we're decolonizing our minds. So whether it be students in South Africa saying that we will no longer want our institutions and our buildings to be named after people like Cecil Rhodes. But then I bring that back to GW because I'm on the Marvin Center renaming committee to think about why are we naming our buildings, or why have our buildings been named after individuals that, I won't sugarcoat it, I don't care, I don't have tenure, but I also don't care, who have racist undertones, racist actions, who are individuals that also just should not be individuals that have been immortalized in history. And if they have been for, like the Marvin Center, for roughly 45, 50 years, you've had your time, sir. And now it's time to move on. And now it's time for someone else to be acknowledged who wasn't a staunch segregationist and a racist. So when we have these conversations about the name of this institution in particular, the fact that our mascot is called the Colonials, how racist can you possibly be? We're talking about decolonizing Africa. Let's have real conversations about what we're doing where we currently pay tuition, right? I'll leave that for you all. I know my colleagues are like, Cheers is going to get fired, but it's cool. When I think of also 60 years of multimedia, as I said in those images, and the reflections on 1960, the year of Africa, the New York Times did an interactive piece earlier this summer. And I'll just leave you all with this point, and then I'll carry it on to my colleagues for our conversation. But Adam Jeshua, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Chicago, in the opening of this interactive piece from the New York Times said, "The Year of Africa, as it came to be known, was a victory for the Black world. It emerged from long-standing global movements for racial equality and gave rise to political and cultural revolutions that forever transformed Africa's place in the world. Along with the triumph of African independence, however, the political crisis of decolonization revealed central quandaries. From the place of ethnic identity in politics to the role and legitimacy of state power, and still trouble the continent and the wider world." We are going to have a conversation this evening about decolonization, and the answers are not evident, and the answers are not prevalent right now. We are still in a constant struggle, and I look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say this evening. So thank you very much for having me, and sorry if I made any trouble.
That's fine, Dr. Shears. If you still want to show your presentation, you should be able to do that. I'm not sure if you can see the share content button.
We can go ahead and go with our prepared our questions, but I'll see what I can do.
Okay. I do have a few moderated questions before we open it up to our attendees. So my first question, some of these have already been alluded to. So as scholars, as practitioners, how do you legitimize forms of knowledge and social practices that have been displaced and denigrated by the history of colonialism, racism, and capitalism? Dr. Zia, Dr. Mzia Kimberly-Clark, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I would say that, the history of scholar activists that have really kind of sought to change these things, is really long. So Dr. Blyden, has talked about that. And I wanted to look at specifically the work of Cheikh Anta Diop, which is probably one of the first scholars that I personally read. Cheikh Anta Diop and Frantz Fanon. I think Frantz Fanon was, for me, the scholar that was transformational. I read him in undergrad, and I was just it was, a lot of their writings were in reaction to what had been published. It was in reaction to, because, many of the first publications on Africa were written by Europeans, and much of it, was racist, and it was written from, this colonial perspective, and it completely dismissed any knowledge production coming out of Africa. But then, even kind of going through time, more recently, one of the scholars I've heard and been influenced by is Professor Akosua Adamako Mpofu, who is a professor at the University of Ghana. She's a professor in the Institute for African Studies there. And I've heard her speak recently on this whole idea of decolonizing African studies. And she did an interview, I think it was a couple months ago, and there was this sense of fatigue that we're still talking about it, that the topic keeps coming up, that this idea of racism within African studies, this idea of even kind of legitimizing traditional knowledge keeps coming up. And she talked about the fact that it keeps coming up means that there is a lack of sincerity, and that perhaps that it's more about optics. This idea of asking the question makes one seem progressive, but there's no real intention on changing. So, for example, the African Studies Association did a survey, I think a couple years ago. They sent out a survey regarding diversity and, racism, blah, blah, blah. And so, I'm like, oh, this is wonderful. They're finally, this is great. So I enthusiastically send in the survey, and like literally nothing has changed. And I'm like, I know, because, I attend ASA, talk to folks at ASA, like it's, at the very, very least, one of the things that ASA could do is have their conference at hotels that are not cost prohibitive. Have their conference at hotels where scholars who are coming from the continent can afford to stay. Scholars, and not to mention graduate students. So there are things that ASA could just really do immediately that could make the conference more accessible if they wanted to. But that doesn't happen. So again, this idea of where is the sincerity? So as far as my own practices as a scholar, I was lucky that my mother was an activist scholar. She was in the field of education. She did educational research. So I went into academia with some understanding of these things. And so when I was confronted with this as a master's student, which is the first time I was confronted, because the undergrad I went to an HBCU, as a master's student at American University, the most important thing it did was it taught me how to fight. So when I was at AU, one of the conversations in one of the classes was, one of the questions was, is there an African intelligentsia? And I was like, wait, what do you mean? What? I'm looking around like, is this what do you mean? What is this? And so the consensus was, yes, but they all, they're all outside of Africa. Huh? And so, me, I am 20s, I don't quite have the language to argue. I don't have, because I don't know the names. I don't know, so, but I know it's wrong. I know that that's not right. Same master's program, another debate. The teacher basically asserts that there is no African feminist movement on the continent. And I'm like, no, I know that can't be right. I know it. Like, I absolutely, this doesn't sound right. So I did my semester paper on African feminism. I'm like, absolutely not. And I still feel to this day, the grade I got on that paper was because that teacher did not agree with my position. But I was going to do that paper because I was like, no, this is, and so it taught me to fight. It taught me that when you're confronted with something that isn't right, something that feels like racism, sounds like racism, smells like racism, how to fight that. And so now when I'm confronted with it in the review process, I get back, these reviewer comments, I now kind of, again, it teaches me how to sharpen my intellectual skills so that I am able to address these more clearly, so that you are more clearly able to understand where I'm coming from, so that I present my arguments in such a way that they are, you may disagree with them, but you can't disprove them. And so it's again, also one of the things is going to conferences, going to ASA, and again, going to presentations, such as going to see white scholars showing images of themselves in Maasai clothing in their presentations, and it's kind of like, look, what does that have to do with anything? Like, I don't understand why do you have that picture there? And it's, this whole, oh, I look at how I was accepted by the natives. And it's like, mm-mm. And so it's kind of being, again, reminding myself that these are the things that to speak up about. Or in these presentations, you see scholars showing, I went to one where they were showing images and talking about the life of LGBTQ individuals who were supposedly in the closet. So why do you have their picture? Why? Excuse me. So again, it is, and confronting it, but also being very intentional about it, but also in my own work, because a lot of my work focuses on hip hop, which is an area that, of course, trying to convince folks that the hip hop artists are legitimate voices, political voices, has been tough. But it's also been something I've been determined to do, and got criticism from reviewers that, this was not intellectual or scholarly or blah, 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 but continued on and kind of revising it and refining it so that I could conquer that specific criticism. So I think rather than giving up and just saying, oh, they're just racist and they don't, getting angry, I think it taught me how to fight. And to be on, I don't want to say they, I don't want to say us, them, but it taught me how to fight within academia, because African studies, as we've all stated, kind of came out of this tradition. We know that. We know academia. We know, the tradition that academia rests in. It's a very kind of Eurocentric institution. And so operating in that space, kind of you learning how to fight in that space, learning how to win in that space, is a very, very important skill to have, especially if you do it while maintaining your integrity and maintaining your intention on being an activist scholar. I think that's very, very important. So that's one of the things that I try to do.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that question. Dr. Blyden?
I think I sort of, in my remarks, talked about ways that I see, at least that I try, right, to combat some of these issues by, teaching from an African perspective, right? That's a large part of how I conceive of my pedagogy, of teaching students using the works. For the longest time, that excuse of, well, there was no history written by Africans, that we didn't have the scholarship by Africans. We don't have, as I said in my remarks, don't have that as an excuse anymore, right? Particularly in my field, there's a burgeoning, continues to be a burgeoning field, African history. And many of much of the interesting work on African history is coming from African scholars. And so trying as much as possible to use that work, right, to privilege those, not those systems of knowledge, to expose students, right? If any student who's ever taken my class, we start, no matter what the class is that has to do with African history, we start with discussions of representations of African history, right? The way in which African history historically has been represented by the West. And every year I think, well, we can get rid of that unit because, of course, everybody knows Africa has a history. Of course, everybody knows that there's all of this fantastic work being done by African scholars and in African studies. And then, somebody says something, you read something in the newspaper and you realize, no, we still have to be reminding people of that. I suppose, which is why, as I said, we're having this conversation in 2020. Who would have thought that, I'd be sitting on a panel, because I'm pretty sure I've sat on this panel before, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, of, decolonizing the African mind. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote that book, what, 30 years ago? I think I read it in graduate school. So, and yet somehow it hasn't made its way. Is that what it is, into the academy? Like Msia says, I don't think that that's the case.
I think it's interesting that you bring that up, but it's also important to talk about power structures and who benefits from sustaining this flawed narrative that Africa and the African peoples are underdeveloped. They're a stagnant society, and that it's a hopeless continent ridden with conflict.
Right.
And
you all are talking about it within the sphere of international relations, and that's of course very different. For many years I couldn't even get my history classes counted in the Elliott School, right? Because international affairs somehow had nothing to do with history. Was that the question, or was that the point, right? So this idea that international affairs is somehow divorced, right, from a historical context is perhaps a conversation that we should be exploring more, right? Which is, I guess, what was the thought process behind both the group that the young woman who introduced us began with, and this panel.
no, I think that perhaps the international affairs curriculum benefits from excluding truly historical narratives from an African perspective, because the dominant narratives of African history are colonial, and they inform a lot of international affairs narratives of the continent and of the people. Dr. Cheers, would you like to respond to the question?
I honestly feel like my colleagues, I don't have anything additional to respond. So if you all don't mind, I'd love to possibly take a stab at your next question, but my colleagues handled that one.
Sure. So my next question is it's related to what Dr. Blyden had mentioned. So African study centers and programs in the U.S. owe their establishment to U.S. military and intelligence interests. Can you deconstruct how they continue to reflect interests in their focus on area and language studies for U.S. citizens, their resource streams, and the organization of their engagement with the U.S. government?
Well, that is a heavy question. I should not have deflected or deferred to my colleagues. So I have like one or two thoughts on that, but that is clearly for Dr. Blyden, and I'm gonna get out the way very, very quickly on that. But I will say I agree. I do believe that African studies centers, and this is from someone, as I mentioned, Dr. Mcia and I, we met in an African studies program, graduate school program at the Howard University here in Washington, D.C. And when I think of, what do those university or what do like these programs in the U.S. owe to establishments of U.S. military intelligence? I go back and forth. I'm going to be very, very clear. I am not a traditional historian the way my colleague, in particular, Dr. Blyden, is. But I am someone who has studied history. I'm not a historian by trade, but I'm someone who has studied history, and I do believe that there was a very clear distinctions. And I bring that up to focus on the fact that U.S. foreign policy is nasty. It is ugly. It is divisive. It is based in white supremacy. And when you look at the way in which and my current research, which is called agricultural apartheid, and I'm looking at land and water rights in South Africa, Namibia, and Palestine. And I have spent a considerable amount of time in all three countries, but the connection with all three of those is US foreign policy and US foreign policy and the way in which the United States supported in 1948 the establishment of the Israeli um, state. Um, and therefore, which those issues with the state of Palestine, that also goes down to the same year that the Republic of South Africa, which then also encompassed what was then referred to and what is now Namibia, the country of Namibia, and all of this foreign policy happened under the guise of U.S. foreign policy. So U.S. foreign policy and military intelligence. I like to remind people. So whether it be the U.S. Backing of the apartheid regime in South Africa, when we think of individuals that are now, especially in death, but I'll give him the fact that the world kind of came around in many instances during his life. That someone like a Nelson Mandela, who depending on what decade or year you pick, either he was a revolutionary liberator and freedom fighter, which is how I view him, um, or a terrorist, which is how the U.S. CIA viewed him up until 2008. 2008. So let's look historically on when he was released from prison in February of 1990. February 1990, and for a solid 18 years afterwards, after being revered worldwide as a liberation leader, the United States still reviewed someone like Nelson Mandela well into his elder years of his life as a terrorist. I think says a lot about the way in which the United States participated in African foreign policies and the way in which our military practice. But Dr. Blyden, I'd love to turn that over to you.
I don't know if I have much more to say than what I already said. And I think it is true that there's still African studies centers and programs, right, which reflect the geopolitical interests of the West. I don't think anybody can deny that. However, we also now have a broader array of alternatives and choices and places that we can turn for alternative perspectives, right? Boston University is not the only place where you can do African studies anymore. Neither is Northwestern, right? You can go to universities on the continent of Africa, right, to get to do African studies into an African studies program. So I think that while it's true that many African studies programs and centers still rely, right, on the kinds of funding that they did at their inception, they're not that many are no longer beholden to those constituencies, and so I certainly feel that that then allows for the teaching of African studies that does not toe the line of the American military or politicians. You can go somewhere else, in other words.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that there's a lot of universities that I've personally looked up outside of DC that are working to decolonize their curriculums. And especially HBCUs, which is why I'm really interested to hear from Dr. Kibrona Clark as to what her perspective is on this.
Yeah, it's interesting. In preparing for this, I actually called my mom and was talking to her about this, and she was actually reminding me that when these programs were, in the 60s and 70s, that there were kind of two types of African studies programs, and one that kind of fit this description, that was kind of dominated by white scholars who often, she was saying, taught African languages that were devoid of any real connection to the culture. And she talked about, around graduation time, there would be men in black suits that would appear on campus to interview people, do background checks, and how much money was pumped into these programs by the government. But she also talked about how during that time, Black studies and African American studies programs emerged, and they emerged out of the civil rights and Black nationalist movements, and that these programs were often run by African Americans, and that many of them incorporated Africa into their curriculum. So, before coming back to Howard to teach, I was teaching at the Pan-African Studies Department at California State University, Los Angeles. And so that would be an example of a department that came out of that tradition. And so many of them also, had offered African languages. Often it was Swahili or, Hausa or something like that. So you had, both types of programs. Of course, the ones that got the most funding were the ones that, surfaced the U.S. interests. But of course, there's still the connection today. And, now when you look at the relationship between these programs and institutions like the World Bank, so it may be a little more subtle than before. There may not be these men in black suits, but you definitely have curricula that definitely presents neoliberal economic policy frameworks as fact and not theory. And neoliberal economics, of course, is is kind of this US favored policy. And so any opposing economic policies or states that are non-compliant with neoliberal economic policies are considered problematic. And so, even in my department, I've kind of been the problematic professor during if I'm on your committee and you're doing anything related to economics and you're using a whole lot of World Bank reports and studies and, as kind of evidence of this country and what they need to do for development, I'm like, well, that's a problem. Why are you citing the World Bank? And so I do think that right now that is where I'm personally seeing the problem. So it may not be kind of this, obvious, blatant, but it's there. It's there in that sense that these universities and these programs are kind of still are promoting neoliberal economics. The languages are often taught by African professors. So that's changed. And so you do have a cultural elements in these programs. And so that is an improvement. But you definitely don't have, they're still fairly conservative and kind of their politics, so there's a lot of room for improvement. Even at Howard, there's room for improvement.
If I could just jump in for a minute and say, since Dr. Clark was talking about HBCUs, there's a long tradition of African studies, what we would call African studies, right, being taught at historically Black colleges and universities. whether we're talking about Howard or Lincoln or Fisk, right? So African studies programs, as we come to know them or as you define them as being in some way in collusion with the military or the government, right, are not necessarily the first programs or to teach about Africa. So I just want to throw that out there.
Thank you for that addition, Dr. Blyden. But I do want to, I think what Dr. Kibona Clark said about neoliberalism provides a perfect segue into the next question. So this definition that Dr. B had kind of alluded to, I want to talk about disconscious racism. So I didn't know what this was for a very long time. So I kind of want to just describe what that is. So it refers to an uncritical habit of mind, including perceptions, attitudes, assumptions, and beliefs that justifies inequality and exploitation by accepting the existing order of things as a given. So my question is that how does disconscious racism underpin and inform the dominant narrative of Africa within the international system? And I think that this heavily connects to neoliberal economics, because neoliberal economics and the expansion of capitalism depends on the exploitation of a large minority. Dr. Clark, would you want to take that question first?
Yeah, I mean, it's, in answering that question, it was, I think a lot was said in answering the previous questions. So, kind of the notes I had were fairly short. So, I would say that in terms of how this kind of informs the dominant narrative of Africa within the international system, it permeates the way we talk, think, and write about Africa in literally every way. Foreign policy, international NGOs, academia, missionary organizations. There is a deep and persistent belief in Africa's inferiority. And it's, revealed in kind of this constant effort to encourage Africa to follow a Western model of politics, economics, development, intellectual traditions, and even religion. And anything not following that model is seen as, backwards, but it's not called backwards. Oh, they're traditionalists or tribal, or that's ethnic, or the politics. I know one of the big kind of struggles after independence was kind of you're not democratic unless you have multiple parties. But there were, states like Tanzania, where I'm originally from. If you have multiple people running for office, you're voting for the person, not the party. So you technically can have democracy with one party if you have him. So, so this idea, well, no, then that's not, you have to have this system that we have decided that you have to have. Otherwise, we're saying that you're undemocratic and you therefore cannot. So, yeah. And it's this idea that, Africans are like children and you have to show them the way. And it's something that I think a lot of the times people are not even conscious of. And yeah, so I think it's there in every single aspect of the way that folks interact with Africans.
Dr. Cheers, would you like to speak on this question?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, my colleagues have both spoken on it, but the fact that, and I think of media, I'm always going to come from a multimedia perspective and a representational perspective. And in one of the slides that I prepared, that for whatever reason I can't share, but technology, I focused on, and I'd love for any of the participants who are here to follow up. Anyone have Netflix? And has anyone seen within the last, I'd probably say 9 months, but maybe before then, especially when it comes to a show, for example, like Queen Sono, that Netflix in particular has participated in providing voices and avenues for African centered content. And a lot of that I do know for the fact that it is just sort of what it is. It tends to be like Nigeria or South Africa. Like there's like these 2 points on the continent. And I feel like other stories, whether even you be, South African adjacent or even like Nigerian adjacent, maybe you're Ghanaian, maybe you're Congolese, maybe you're Tanzanian, maybe you're East African, and you have different stories. But it's almost like in a continent of over a billion people, there are like two perspectives that we get from a multimedia standpoint. And from someone who not to date myself, but also to date myself, I'm a Netflix subscriber from when you could opt for one or two DVDs at a time. Anybody else? You could. Dr. Clark is like, yes, me. We're like, you had an option, right? If you wanted to engage in Netflix content, you could get like one DVD. It wasn't even a Blu-ray. Blu-ray didn't even exist then. It was like you get one DVD or like three DVDs at a time, depending on your subscription status. And to think of where we went from there to the fact that now there's original content. I watched earlier this summer in quarantine Blood and Water, which all too familiar, reminded me of like my high school in South Africa. It was a little too close, but I thought it was also like a great sort of like trashy drama of like high school and exactly what I needed at the time. Whether it be Queen Sono, so many other films. But the representation, right? When we think of like, how do you view the continent and in all of its diversity and in all of its there's a blessing and a curse of wanting to be inclusive, right? You're like, oh, we want to bring everyone in, so we're going to group Africa into these two silos, as I mentioned. West Africa, and West Africa only means Nigeria, like I mentioned, it excludes everyone else, or South Africa, and that excludes every other. We all know that there's 54 continents or countries, excuse me, on the continent, and then you only have these two perspectives. So for me, when we have a question, as you just posed, where we're really looking at and examining and the underpinnings of international systems and racism and the way in which we view the continent, and whether it be a question of scholarly examining issues of African politics or history or culture, but for a lot of us, the only insights we see into the continent are for what the things that come across our screen. And a lot of times the only things that we see across our screen are programming that comes from a larger viewpoint, and in particular what we're seeing now. And I want to preface also and say that, like, I give Netflix props. Nobody else in terms of a streaming service, we're giving these stories, these actors, actresses, storylines, content creators. I just want to say that in general, content creators. And yes, if you people are gonna like want to DM me and throw me on Twitter and talk about, but there was a Nigerian, there was all sorts of content coming from the continent for decades. And my response is absolutely. But on the level that a series such as Blood and Water or Queen Sono, we haven't seen that on an international platform the way we have until recently. And I mean recently as in like the last 3 months. So on the one hand, I'm grateful. I'm grateful that more African voices are able to speak for themselves. I want to preface that. I think it's, as someone who studies and focuses on representation, it is critical that that it isn't, the fact that the three panelists you chose today, and we are all connected, and have studied and lived our lives, and constantly. I've been trying to get on Dr. Clark's. I'm a caller out because I've been trying to get on working with Dr. Clark on like hip hop for like years. So if this is recorded, I'm saying it again that I want to work with Dr. Clark when it comes to like hip hop in a documentary. So you've heard it third time, Dr. Clark, but for many of you all the first time. And I remember when Dr. Blyden was sharing with me about her current now amazing book that she knows I have a copy of. She signed a copy of it for me. Thank you. Her amazing work. And these things take a lot of time, whether it be scholarly works. But what I'm grateful for is when we see the pop culture representation. So whether it be, I'm a Peloton user, shout out, but whether it be an Afrobeats ride from an artist like Tunde Oyenade, where she is highlighting for millions of people Afrobeats music that individuals might not have ever heard of, or Netflix for sharing African centered content, that's a start. It's a start. It's a start. And I hope that people continue to engage and listen to individuals on the content and throughout the diaspora who are sharing just really great works.
Thank you so much for bringing in your very unique perspective. Before I do want to open up the questions to the rest, but before we do that, Dr. Blyden, I know you mentioned you talked about disconscious racism in your remarks. Do you have anything to add?
Not much more to add. As I said, my interest in it was in understanding ways in which it gets internalized, right? Where we come to accept it as a norm, even people of African descent, right? Come to accept it as a norm. And that's where my interest was in. And I think this notion that when you have this kind of varied representation as we're having now, whether in film and music, in other ways, we're seeing, at least I am seeing, I don't want to say a resurgence, but certainly a growing sort of representate different kinds of representation of the continent, which I'm happy about.
Thank you so much for that. So we have one question. If the attendees have more questions, I welcome you to put them in the Q&A box. But the first one is, Dr. Mzia mentioned that the work of African scholars tend to be reactions to racist works. Do you see any shifts into scholars doing proactive publications? And what would this proactive approach to producing knowledge look like?
No, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's, scholars do both. So I first started writing about hip hop in Africa as a reaction to what I was reading about hip hop in Africa, because it was wrong. It was so wrong. But then recently I was writing on, specifically been interested in kind of African feminist voices in hip hop in Africa. And as I was kind of, listening, it was like, oh, wow, wanting to, proactively look at how African women in hip hop are, presenting these feminist voices without identifying as feminists, and how that is adding to or contributing to conversations kind of in traditional African feminist circles. So, that is, again, taking a voice that may not necessarily have been invited into, that space, and kind of bringing it into that space. I also have a podcast, the African Hip Hop Podcast, and one of the things that we've done is connect it to the Department of African Studies in Howard, and also, with the class I teach, the Hip Hop in Africa class, is a class with GW students and Howard students, and so the students also, they do a podcast as well, and so it is my attempt to bring hip hop discussions into an academic space. And so again, that's kind of being more, proactive in saying these voices are, they have something to say, and these are legitimate voices. And so, yeah, I do think that scholars is, create narratives and kind of and I think one of the things that every scholar really wants to do and hopes to do, you kind of want to blaze your own path. You don't really want to spend your career kind of following someone else's path. There's nothing greater than kind of forging new territory and kind of being the first one there and finding something valuable and kind of planting your flag and establishing your name. That's great. That is an awesome thing. So yeah, no, I think definitely scholars definitely want to be very proactive and doing these things and not just react.
Dr. Cheers or Dr. Blyden, do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry, I'll jump in quickly. Thank you. I would echo my colleagues' feedback, and then also say that I think it's I would like to put a lot of onus on my students, and even participants in these larger conversations. So first of all, we know that anyone who is taking the time out on their Wednesday night to participate in this WebEx is here because, on the one hand, you for all intents and purposes agree with what a lot of what we are saying, right? Like, very few people here are like, these three scholars are absolutely crazy. Most of you all are like, we're like-minded individuals. And on the one hand, I absolutely love preaching to the choir. It's kind of easy, right? Like, I'm not going to get a lot of dissent. People are going to be like, yeah, what she said. Yeah, get it, girl. But what I want to always challenge the audience, and especially in this virtual setting where I can't see any of you all, where I have no idea how many people are here. I could possibly just be talking to like 4 people right now, and that's including myself, the other presenters, and like the 3 student organizers. But I always want to question and ask you all to think of, and I didn't realize that this picture here, this picture right here, this is of my son and my father when we were in outside of Cape Town last summer on my research trip. And I'm recording women in a township farming. And I look over as I am filming these women farming, and I look over and I see my dad and my son in these like mirror poses. Why do I bring that up? I bring it up because when we're always talking in sort of vacuums and silos, it's really important to look up and around. So I was focused on getting my shots of the women I was there to interview. I was in Guguletu, which I'm sure Dr. Clark and Dr. Blyden have probably been to, but I'm right outside of Cape Town in a pretty popular township. And I'm talking to farmers and I'm engaging with these women, but I stopped and I looked up and I looked around and I caught this shot. And it's one of my most favorite shots that I've ever taken in 40 years of like documenting. Why is it my favorite? Because I was able to see a different perspective of what I was seeing. And so while we're talking about this and all of these conversations, I challenge everyone on this call, whether it be your frustration with the lack of accountability for the murder of Breonna Taylor, whether it be your frustration with the fact that the United States Senate is going to push through a Supreme Court nominee, whether it be your frustration with the fact that 200,000 Americans have lost their lives in this global pandemic. If you are frustrated and angry and impassioned and empowered, I want to challenge you to look up and look around and possibly see a different perspective. It's really hard to do that when we talk about these larger, we're talking conceptual, right? We're having these larger conceptual theoretical conversations, and that's amazing and that's important. And that's important. And why does she keep bringing up Breonna Taylor? Why does she keep bringing up, we're talking about Africa and she keeps talking about like US politics and everything. We came here to not talk about US politics. Sorry, because everything connects. Everything intersects. As I said before in my remarks, Breonna Taylor's murder very much so reminds me of a Stephen Biko's murder. They kind of rings very similar for me, personally. It very much so reminds me of an Amadou Diallo murder. That's what happened my freshman year of college at Washington University in St. Louis. That's the murder that enraged me to get involved and to get active and to start thinking about things that were bigger than myself. So as we're beginning to wrap up this call and people are like, what are the takeaways? Because that's at the end point. What are we taking away from this? We've been sitting here for the last hour and a half. What are we going to walk away with? I hope anyone on this call who is still here and is still listening walks away with the idea that they look up and they look around and they start connecting dots. They start connecting their frustrations. They start finding ways that their pain can turn to power and purpose, that their frustrations and the fact that they feel disempowered can lead to what we saw in 1960. 17 nations declared their independence and stood up. Has it all been perfect? Absolutely not. We could talk for another 6 decades about what could have, should have been different and done better, and the media representation. We can go on for epicenters, but we're not. I just hope, I really hope that when we walk away from this, when everyone closes their browsers, that they're not defeated, that they're empowered, and that they think of how can I continue to engage? How can I take from what I've seen from 1960 and the year of Africa and what these countries did, what Patrice Lumumba was never able to see through fruition because he was murdered by the US CIA, but I won't talk about that. But look it up. There's documentaries on that and how we can move forward and do some empowering things. So thank you so much.
We do have a few more questions, if that's okay with Dr. Kuna Clark, Dr. Blyden, Dr. Cheers, if we can take a few of those questions from the audience. So one really interesting question from Hannah from YBPI is, how can we use concepts of reconciliation and accountability in a transnational, intergenerational way that reorients the way we learn and unlearn Eurocentric ideologies that were entrenched in so much of academia, syllabi, and pedagogy? Dr. Blyden, would you like to speak on that?
Honestly, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll take a stab at it because I think she's getting at the idea of how do we change pedagogies? Is that how we change a Eurocentric? Is that that's how I'm going to interpret it, right? And many of us are already doing that, right? In the readings that we assign, in the authors that we assign, in taking an African-centered perspective, right? I ended my prepared remarks by saying, let's privilege African systems of knowledge, if not mostly always, right? And that's what many of us try to do, to say that we don't any longer, as we did 50, 60 years ago, have to rely on knowledge about Africa produced by Europeans. Some of it was very good. I still use some of it, right? But we don't have to exclusively rely on that, because we now have at least in my field, right? Maybe not so much in international relations, which is at the heart of this conversation, but certainly in my field, right? History, which should be at the heart of international relations, right? There's enough and more coming of representations of Africa, whether from African scholars or others, that can help us to decolonize our syllabi. My syllabi are decolonized. I can say that quite confidently. So, yeah.
Dr. Clark?
There is actually there's a podcast, a Twitter account, Cite Black Women, hashtag Cite Black Women. That's one. So I think citing Black scholars, citing African scholars, not just those that are based in the West, but those that are based on a continent. It's not that hard to find their works, especially now that, we're online. A lot of stuff is available online. You can find scholarship very easily. So I think that's one big thing, is citing the works of African scholars. In our syllabi, again, I have made a very concerted effort to cite and to use scholarship that was produced by African scholars, and have even been able to, on a couple of occasions, assign books that were published by African publishers. So through was the African Books Collective, they're they're distributed. They distribute books that were published in African estates. So you're able to assign books that way. So I think that's another kind of important thing. I think that's a good place to start. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree. Do the work. Do the work. We're all doing it. I think it's a bit ridiculous to think that your faculty members are going to be the only one. I love to remind my students that Google is free 365 days a year. If you are looking for anything, and I do mean that's anything, y'all will Google anything. Places to have brunch on Saturday that are open due to COVID restrictions. Like, you all will Google anything. So also Google and engage in African scholars and their work. Look people up. I know that for a lot of students in particular, you are challenged. You are challenged right now because you feel like there's been times that you've been deceived by scholars, and you're nervous about who to trust and who to go with. But I will say, do your due diligence. Do your due diligence in looking up, and majority of us, for better or for worse, all of kind of our scholarly and our professional work is out there to be reviewed. So you're able to see who is authentic and who isn't. And that goes for everything from scholars to follow to restaurants to visit, right? Like, let's just do the work. Let's do the work. Let's not underestimate the fact that you can literally search and find information that hopefully keeps you better informed.
Thank you so much for those remarks from all of our panelists. Do you have anything to add before we end the event, Dr. Clark?
No, I mean, thank you for, having it and having this conversation. I definitely, hope that people carry the information with them and, kind of next steps, or like Dr. Shear said, are able to kind of take this information and move forward. I think this is, I've looked around and just the times that we're in. I think other than, of course, the coronavirus, that's historic, but I think that aside, we're living through a summer that is truly historic in terms of race conversations, kind of the summer of BLM. And I think that the conversations that we're having are really, really important, and we're having tough conversations. And I think that within that kind of context, I think these conversations, they're, I don't know, I'm trying to be optimistic because we've had this conversation about racism in the academy so many times. So I'm kind of like, well, maybe now, because, this is all this other stuff is happening and we're seeing all of these other people, Black Lives Matter, great. Now, maybe within academia, Black Lives can matter. So hopeful.
Dr. Blyden?
I mean, I guess I would echo that, right? That we're talking about things having to do with the academy, but as Dr. Chia said, it's all connected. It's connected to the larger world. It's connected to the larger American society. So I guess I would leave with the idea that you all, as future government officials, public policy framers, ambassadors, diplomats, right, will go when you go to your various posts in Africa with a decolonized mind.
Dr. Cheers, do you have anything else to add?
Go vote. Vote. Yesterday was National Voters Registrations Day. Go vote. I hope many of you, as Dr. Blyden just said, will be international diplomats. Please make sure that you are still voting and participating in this American democracy that we have. Participate, engage. It is so important and so critical that we remain active. They remain active. So the policies, what I always want us to do is to move out of these ivory towers and into the streets. Let's have these real conversations. Let's get out here and participate and make sure. Because in particular, I know with my colleagues on the panel this evening, a lot of the work that we do, yes, we're seen in these scholarly avenues and spaces, but we are in with the people. We are monks and in with the people. And Dr. Clark, I know, she's out here listening to hip hop and engaging in the community. Dr. Blyden is engaged in the community. I am constantly engaged in the community. So please remain engaged. Please do not lose hope. If there is one thing I am constantly reminded when I get frustrated, I was really frustrated today. I'm not gonna lie. When I heard what the grand jury did not indict and the choices they made in the case of Breonna Taylor, that woman was sleeping. She was sleeping. I'm so infuriated. But I am reminded not to lose hope. I'm reminded of the work that Patrice Lumumba did. I'm reminded of the work that people such as Stephen B. Like, I'm just reminded of all of the individuals across the diaspora who have done to move, who have been individuals who have lost their lives in these fights for just living and being. Not even equality. Breonna Taylor wasn't out here as a martyr. She was asleep. She was asleep. So it really is something that I want to remind people: don't lose hope. Please remain active. Please remain engaged, and please make sure if there's anything that if you take away from tonight, please make sure that you're registered to vote. That's all.
I want to just finish off by saying that I really appreciate the time that the three of you have taken to come and speak with us, and I love that we have ended this note on the idea that everything is interconnected. I think that's why it was so essential to have this conversation for me, at least, because people don't realize that sometimes that the US exports a lot of their domestic problems that they have with racism and the systematic inequality. So thank you so much for all pointing that out. I want to thank our co-sponsors as well and all the attendees for coming out. So I learned a lot from you all, and I hope that all our attendees and members did too. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye, Dr. B. I'll see you soon.
See you next week.
Bye, Dr. Cheers. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.